Welcome back. Joining me now is Edla Prevette. Edla is a licensed clinical mental health counselor. For over 30 years, she has counseled children and adults of all ages. She was her parents' caregiver for a decade and found information about the day-to-day challenges of caring for aging parents while working and raising teenagers almost non-existent. It was a roller coaster of inner conflict, mental turmoil, and anticipatory grief. After her parents passed away and her nest was empty, she decided to pivot her work and focus on supporting adults sandwiched between their lives and their aging parents. She offers a group program called 180 when the parental roles reverse. She consults and does speaking engagements to support adults through this very challenging time. And Edla, this is something I know a little bit about. I was a caregiver to my mother, albeit not for as long as many people are. My mom only lived 80 days.
Wow.
But this was back in 2012. And, there's no playbook, right?
Mhm.
It was overwhelming. And I felt like, nobody had the answer. So kudos for you for doing this work. Tell me a little bit about how you got into this and why you decided this was a direction you wanted to go.
Well, there were a lot of things that led up to it, as usual, whenever you have a change. When years ago, when my parents asked me if I would be their executor and their power of attorney, right, I was naive. I said, sure, I can do that. So I think my first thing was agreeing to be their caregiver. When they were perfectly healthy. And I went through sort of a naive stage of what that was going to look like and mean. Then, sort of the next standout of how on this journey was my dad's health started to decline. And to your point, like your mother got a diagnosis, a cancer diagnosis in 80 days, and that was it. And that's almost like a different conversation than like my dad just began to start aging and
Declining.
declining. And we started seeing these changes. And I'm still naive. I'm still thinking that mom and dad are just going to problem solve and it's going to be a reasonable, shift. And that's not how it was. And then I went through sort of a confused and baffled stage. Why aren't they like listening? Why aren't they problem solving the same way? Why can't I reason with them? And we were getting into a lot of conflict, my mom, my dad, and myself, and my siblings, right? So we went through this really confused, baffled stage. Well, I don't like to live there very long, just in
Mm-hmm.
general, as a person. So then I moved into what I called the learning phase, where I started scouring the internet. And at the time I worked at a place called Project Enlightenment. You might be familiar with that. And I was doing some parent work, and there was tons of information out there about how to parent your young children. And I thought there's got to be some similar stuff for the aging population. And there really wasn't. There was things about writing wills or finding financial things to work through, or home placement or home care, but not the problem solving, the day to day decisions, the day to day conflicts, just all the behavioral changes. And so I started scouring the internet, picking everyone's brain, and trying to figure out how to be more proactive through this process than reactive. And I did pretty good. I mean, because my dad passed, and then I had to be my mother's caregiver for another 7 years, and she had a much more let's just say challenging personality, and so I needed a few more tricks up my sleeve. And so then when mom died, I was on a walk listening to a podcast. I don't even know what it was, and it just, whatever they were talking about, I just got this feeling that I needed to take everything that I'd learned and put it out into the world. And so that's what I did. I started going, how can I pivot my private practice? I still see children, I still see adults, but how can I pivot a little bit and add this so that I can help a completely different group of people than I had been supporting before? So that's kind of the journey of, because it wasn't a straight shot. It was more of a winding road.
Right. And most career journeys are like that, right? Or passion projects
Yeah,
or whatever you end up doing tends to not be linear. It tends to be something that you come to through a lot of different
right.
ways. And so, from what you're saying, it sounds like to me, we need to start as adult children thinking about these things and working on them before they become big issues.
Yes.
So, what kind of
Mhm.
advice do you give your clients when they come to you and say, "Hey, my parents are declining. We're trying to figure out next steps." What should people start to think about and put in place?
Well, that's going to be sort of a three-part answer, if that's okay. So, first of
Sure.
all, rarely do they come ahead of time. They all something's usually happened. And it might not be a huge crisis, but they've noticed something. Either they're not wanting the parents aren't wanting to participate in things the same way, or they're having trouble processing some information, or they fall, or they're just not as secure on their physically as comfortable. So generally, they don't come to see me until something's happened, and that's okay. I mean, it's kind of like when if you're going to have a baby, I mean, you might do a little bit of prep work, but it's usually buy the nursery furniture and some of those things. It's not until something's happening that you're like,
Right.
the baby's not
It becomes a
sleeping, what do
crisis.
I do, right? And so that's more often when they come to me. So one part of what I do is for my audience, the people that are in my world, is a lot of education, because there's so much that people just don't know about developmental stages of aging, right? So I'm going to pause because I think that's so important. We read about what's typical for a 1 year old, a 2 year old, or a 3 year old, but then people don't read about development across the lifespan. And you take a 60-year-old, a 70-year-old, a 80-year-old, 81, 83, 85, 90, 95-year-old, and there's some things that are typical developmental stages, but people don't generally know what they are. And so I do a lot of education around kind of understanding the difference between typical aging versus something that's atypical, right? So that the adult child can adjust the way that they engage their parents, so that the relationship stays intact, because the roles kind of reverse. It's not an immediate shift. It's more of a subtle shift. I think the other thing that I do, in addition to education about just typical aging, is talking about how temperament, but also how decline or changes in the body impact behavior. Because oftentimes my clients want to focus on the parent's behavior, and I'm like, we got to look what's underneath that, because that's really where you want to focus your attention. So some of it's general. It's easy to talk about with groups of people, and then sometimes I need to do more one-on-one, depending on what the circumstances are. I would say the other thing is really looking at the kind of do's and don'ts, like what to do when your parent says or does A, B, or C, and what not to do. And there's some real concrete strategies of things that are pretty do's and don'ts across the board. So I talk about that a lot through just the blogs that I write, the one-on-one interactions with people. I talk a lot about caregiver stress because it sneaks up on you. I mean,
Yeah,
sometimes
it
it
sure
doesn't, but
does.
a lot of times, because if it's going on for, like in my case, over 10 years, it's just like a slow drip, right? It's just that pervasive caregiver stress, and sort of, so, but to think about doing some self-care strategies when you're in the middle of that, I mean, people just look at me and like roll their eyes, or like, are you kidding me? I don't have time to take a shower, much less
You're right. You're on
you're
deck.
on
Eh,
deck.
yeah,
100%.
all the time.
Mm-hmm. And then,
So I wrote down a bunch of things I want to before we get too
all
far,
right,
because
go, go.
you've just brought up so many really
Right.
important
Mm-hmm.
topics. So the role reversal, I was not prepared for that. I was totally shocked by that because my mom had an immediate
Yeah,
decline
yours flipped pretty
instead of
quick. Mm-hmm.
right.
Mm-hmm.
been having a slow decline, but I wasn't aware because she was in
Oh,
Pennsylvania. I
yeah.
was here. She was a lawyer. She worked full time. She had no obvious health
Mm,
problems. And then she was, boom, diagnosed with a brain tumor,
right,
went downhill very
right,
quickly. And all of a sudden, I'm feeding my mother and bathing my mother. And this was a woman that was fiercely independent
right.
and strong. So that is really, I think that's a big thing
Yes,
to take in as a caregiver.
yes.
What to say and not to say. Dementia, right, is a very unique, there are very specific things that people will believe when they have dementia that aren't necessarily true.
Correct.
And yet you will go down that path with them as to not disrupt, correct?
Yeah,
Is that
well,
something?
yes, and I'm glad that you brought up dementia because I get that question a lot. I just did a summit and I interviewed Carrie Alberts, who's kind of a dementia expert, and we were taught for a long time about the differences between aging and some of the typical cognitive changes that come along versus dementia related. And absolutely, there's some do's and don'ts, almost different skills, different kind of skill set if someone has dementia. But there is some overlap with people that just have typical developing. Because I'll use an example like my mother did not have dementia, but as she got older, she lived until 89. And in those last like 5 years, her ability to process information slowed down so much. So I was rapid firing, you know, directions, 3-step directions, do A, do B, do C. And then she would get agitated with me. So I had to learn to like
Just slow
slow
down.
down, you know, take a left, go 1 mile, take a right. And that's hard to do.
I'm there, Edla. I'm there. You got to tell me that when I'm driving. Um, Another thing you talked about, and I think this is also something that we don't realize is I joked that my mom became the best version of herself when she was dying.
Hmm.
She was type A, kind of intense, and she was always kind, but she became really laid back and even kinder.
Wow.
That is not the experience a lot of my
Correct.
friends have
That's
had.
right. Yeah.
And that sometimes their loved ones will say things to caregivers,
Sure.
maybe not you, but to somebody else, and then they lose that caregiver,
Sure.
or they have to leave a facility because of their
Absolutely.
language.
And
So again, that's really
yeah,
tough.
and you see that oftentimes, especially in people that have dementia. But I would also say that just typically developing people or aging people will have their filter changes a little bit. And so that's just a natural part of it. And so that's why you circle back to what I said in the very beginning. You have to look underneath the behavior that you see, because sometimes, I mean, you are lucky if they're sweet and kind. Those people aren't calling me. Those people don't seek me out if they're aging
Yeah.
parents sweet and kind. Not
Yeah.
usually. I have a
Right.
few, but not
I
usually.
gotcha. I
But
gotcha.
but if it's, if they're belligerent or snarky or all the challenging things, um, it's really a matter of kind of figuring out where that's coming from so that you can be proactive in the way that you respond, in the way that you react. And sometimes it's not, it's so easy to say, don't take it personally, but it's really like if it's triggering you, I mean, if it's giving you a
Mhm.
zing, if it's like making you grit your teeth and roll your eyes, then that's where I will help the caregiver look in the mirror. Okay, let's what we need to do some you work, because you can't expect this elderly person. It's like trying to get a 3-year-old to do something
To
different
stop
sometimes.
doing some
Right.
behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's when that kind of dovetails really nicely into the stress,
Oh, yeah.
which you were talking
Hmm.
about. And I felt a lot of stress because, you're the caregiver. So you have the physical
Right.
stress. You have, I mean, I had stress lifting my mother. I had stress getting her to doctor's appointments and trying to navigate all that. I had stress with health insurance. And then you have the emotional stress, of doing that, trying to get along with your loved one and trying not to trigger them or trigger yourself. And then you're just exhausted. And then you have that grief that's kind of looming out there because you know where this is going. So,
Yeah.
so what kind of
Well,
advice do you give to people?
Well, I'll tell you. So I'll circle back to that a second, but like that proverbial task list that you just listed, the doctors, the bathing, the da 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 da. So what happens when you're working on those things, what comes last is the emotional piece. Like,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not as obvious, I guess, for lack of a better way to think about it. So we kind of push it aside because it's like, I can't afford to lose it because I have too much to do. So we just stuff it, stuff it, stuff it, stuff it, stuff it. And then the caregivers will oftentimes get sick, quote unquote, in some way, shape, or form. Either, like you said, you had the physical difficulty of moving your mother, they pull out their back, or they get sick, or, they have other things that come into play. So it's so important to look at that piece as well. I need another metaphor, but it's the old put the oxygen mask on yourself first, right?
And maybe, yeah. And for me, it was delegating. I
Oh,
had to
yeah,
learn how to delegate my husband,
absolutely.
babysitters, other family members, friends. I had to say, this is what I need,
Right, and
you know,
and that is, I'm glad that you brought that up also, because you do have to start building a, sort of a
community.
village or a community. But I will
Hmm.
say the hard part of that is that the caregiver has to be the CEO. The caregiver
Hmm.
has to be the supervisor. And for some caregivers, that feels unmanageable. Like it's almost easier to do it themselves than to try to have to find the phone number to call
To
the person.
manage,
Yeah,
right?
it's because there's a whole just management piece. And so when I work with caregivers one on one, or even in small groups, we kind of look at your own personal strengths, but then your own personal things that are challenging for you, just in your sort of day to day life. Like me, I'm uber organized, right? I mean, I can, like, if I'm overwhelmed, the first thing I'm gonna do is sit down and organize it, even to the point that I'll put it
Hmm.
in different buckets, right? Like,
We might be related. We might be related.
because I'm like, this is just craziness, out of control. I don't know which way to go. But for some people, that doesn't work. So then I help them kind of look at, okay, if this is not your strength, if this is challenging for you, who can do it? Who is the person in your family or in your
Sure.
peer group? Because most people will say yes if you ask them for help. Most people will say yes. Some, maybe not.
But I think they also want to help.
Oh,
And
yeah,
what I've told people from my experience is give somebody a tangible assignment. I
absolutely.
mean, my mother liked this really weird brand of tapioca pudding.
Right.
And I had a friend that literally went all over town. She went to every store and bought it out
Right.
and just came with this huge bag
Aw,
of the tapioca pudding because my mom couldn't eat solid
sure.
food. And it was just great. It was exactly what we needed,
And that's the
you
kind of
know?
thing that, you know, so when you first were talking about how the ways that I help people, so it's like a general way where I give general information, but then it kind of dovetails all the way across to the really specific things, just like what you said. Your friend going out and buy the tapioca pudding. You also said that when your roles flipped pretty quickly, that you are now bathing your mother and feeding your mother.
Hmm.
And I talk to my clients a lot about that too. Some people are not comfortable doing some things. Like one client, it was a male, and he just wasn't comfortable bathing his mother. It doesn't matter if you think that's crazy or not. That's how he felt, and that's how it was. I said, okay, then let's figure something else out, right?
Right. Get a
Yeah,
CNA, get somebody
yeah,
who can come in.
there's different things, or there might be a sibling, or there might be a
Hmm.
neighbor, or there's because not everybody has the financial resources, and so then that's another thing
Sure.
that I
A
you have to
barrier.
get creative, because if people don't have the resources, or the the aging parent's so stubborn and they don't have dementia, they still have their faculties, but they just
Right.
dig in
And don't want
and
the child to do that.
don't want to change anything. And then that's kind of the do's and don'ts where we get into. I was like, okay, that kind of personality, you've got to treat them with little kid gloves, and there's a few different ways you have to
Yeah. My
approach them.
mom got a little snarky about lifting because
Mm,
she was worried when I was
yeah,
lifting her to the wheelchair, from the bed to the car, to the table, whatever, for treatment. and it was challenging. We had a physical therapist who was trying to show me how to use the belt. My mom did not want to use the
Was
belt.
she worried for you, or that you were going to
No,
get
she was
hurt?
worried I was going to
Drop
drop
her.
her.
Yeah, and
Yeah, and
yeah, and
yeah,
that's another thing that a lot of people don't know is that as you age, have you heard of sensory issues in children, like children that are
sure,
right, right.
sure,
Well, as people age, some of those senses fade
get stronger.
also. Well, they fade. So you say it's obvious our eyes get worse and our hearing gets worse, but their sense of touch. And so if
Mm,
they're getting a touch on the arm, they're like, oh, you're hugging me too tight. So imagine that belt could have
yeah,
also just hurt. I remember my mom getting her blood pressure taken. She's like, oh, it's so tight. And I was like,
yeah. It's
it's
not any
because the
tighter than it's
skin
ever
becomes
been.
so thin and they become so sensitive.
Right.
But it sounds like she was just being, like they're just being hard headed or something.
Yeah, and I knew that. I knew that it was a real fear.
Sure.
And so, we had to work through that, and there were times I had to ask for help from people that were technically not allowed to
Yeah.
help. Medical providers are not allowed to
Right.
lift in most facilities,
Right.
but I was very fortunate to find people who would help. She
Well,
also refused to wear a bra
uh,
when I took her to
yeah.
treatment. So, I would put on like a t-shirt and a sweatshirt. She'd say, "Why do I
I,
care? I'm dying." And I'm like, "Mom, a couple things you mentioned too have brought this to mind. This doesn't happen in a vacuum.
no.
Caregiving does not happen in a vacuum. People are working.
Right.
People have bills to pay. People have children. People have
Mhm.
spouses. People are trying to navigate, should I bring this parent to my home? Should I keep the parent in their home? What if they live far away? My mom was from
Yeah.
Pennsylvania, so I brought her to my home in North Carolina. Should I disrupt her from her community? There's so many things swirling
Yes.
around. Life just keeps going.
Yes.
And so somehow you have to navigate that along with the caregiving. And I guess that's probably really challenging for a lot of the people that you are
Yeah,
helping.
because so the sandwich generation is what we call that, when you're sandwiched between sort of your life, your responsibilities, your kids, whatever, and your aging parents, and the trend of people living so much longer, right? So people are living a lot longer, and then a lot of people are delaying their own families till later. So I have a client right now. She's got a 9-year-old daughter and a 94-year-old father.
Wow. That's
Right,
a big spread.
because
Big spread.
right, but because of the way that, everybody was born. And so you've got these, and some people have a double sandwich. They're taking care of their grandkids and their parents. And so there's all these variables. Distance is a variable, finances are a variable. And those there's some guidelines of things to consider when you've got all of these variables, but the first thing I have people do is like make a list of the variables that impede your ability to be a caregiver, and then we sort of break them apart one by one to figure out, because you're right, if it, not everybody has the luxury of bringing their parents to them, not everybody has the luxury of going to their parents. Some people are like, there's absolutely no way I'm bringing my mom to my house.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that may be the best choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Or the
Depending
only
on the
choice for
situation.
some people because they don't have the finances or the resources.
Right. Well, it sounds like you're really doing a lot of great work to help people through this. So, as we wrap this up, I want to know, are there things that we can be doing in advance? Should we be having conversations with our parents about what do you think you're going to want?
Mhm.
Where do you think you're going to want to be? What would be the ideal situation so that maybe we don't get to the point where we're in crisis and haven't thought any of this through?
Yes, I think absolutely those things are important conversations to have. There's just a few, and I think we all know that, but it often just feels like we've got a long time, right? It feels like it's like we've got a long time before this is going to happen. But there's a few things that I encourage people to do. One, let's don't do this at the Thanksgiving table, right? Timing is everything. So also I tell people to kind of try to make it a more organic conversation, when it comes up. Maybe you've read an article or you've listened to a podcast. Sometimes I'll tell people to like drop breadcrumbs. It's like some will come to you. Like my mother, she came to me and she said, "Okay, this is what we want to do." Right? I didn't have to worry about that, but that is not always the case. There's some, probably half of them will come. They'll make plans, but kind of dropping breadcrumbs along the way to so you can foster the conversation, right? So it's not a matter of sending an email there by like, okay, we're gonna have a family meeting and we're gonna discuss next steps. I mean, maybe your family can do that, but I wouldn't say that's the
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 norm.
norm, right? And so I would think about um, organically talking about them, saying what your own wishes are, just dropping little open-ended questions. There's a group called fivewishes.org that has like a pamphlet that people can buy, and there's sort of like conversation starters about some of these things. So yeah, I think there's definitely a way to do that. I would also say you can't anticipate everything. I swear I thought my mother and I had everything figured out. And then she had a stroke. Boom. And then we were scrambling. Like we thought we had prepared for that and we missed a piece, right? So just give yourself a little bit of grace and be as proactive as you can, knowing that there's always going to be those sort of daily fires that you have to put
That you
out
don't
that you
expect. Yeah.
don't
And
expect.
especially when you're dealing with cancer, for
Oh,
example,
true.
it's up in the air.
Right.
You never know what's going to happen from day to
Right.
day.
I was talking to someone the other day and she's been struggling, struggling, struggling. And then the with her dad, and then he had a car accident and it flipped every like they had been doing so
Right.
much planning, then he has this horrific car accident, and so now
And that
she's
changes
having to like
everything.
readjust. Yeah, so
Well, Edla, thank you so
yeah,
much. I want to know, for people that want more
sure.
information about what you do, how can they follow you? I'm going to put all your links, your website, your social media in the
Right,
notes for this
right.
podcast. So I would imagine those are the best places to find
Yeah,
you.
and what I really, because I can give them some immediate relief very quickly if they go to my website, edlaprevette.com. I've got two free resources there. One is a communication guide. It's called the bookend technique, where they can start having these conversations immediately more successful. It doesn't cost well, your email, you got to put your email in, but otherwise you can just have it. And then the other one that is I love is a video that I made about understanding brain science and how that impacts your parents' behavior and then what you do about it. Both of those resources are free and they're right on the front page of my website, edlaprevette.com. So I encourage them to start there. That'll give them a great jumping off place, starting place for, engaging and understanding what's going on with their parents a little better. Yeah.
Thank you so much for
Yes.
being here today. I really appreciate it. And I know my audience is going to get a
Oh, I
lot from
hope
this
so. I hope
conversation.
so. It was a great
Thank you.
conversation. Thanks, Amanda.